studies have shown that people who partake in assisted suicide and euthanasia tend to have less social connections, less close family connections than others. So loneliness does play a very key role. And interestingly, earlier this year, the Surgeon General of the United States declared loneliness an epidemic in the United States.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley inContext, and today my guest is Dr. Richard Weikart. He is the author of Unnatural Death, Medicine's Descent from Healing to Killing. And in full disclosure, when I first saw a preview copy of this and read the title, I was a little bit on my heels until I got the book and read it. And I know you're going to be fascinated by this conversation. Richard is a professor of history at California State University. He has recently completed a documentary project called Exploring the Reformation and Revivals in Germany. It's available on YouTube. He's published 6 books. The most recent one, The Death of Humanity, A Case for Life, Hitler's Religion, The Twisted Beliefs That Drove the Third Reich. Previous books include From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany, Hitler's Ethic, The Nazi Pursuit of Evolutionary Progress. They're all published by Palgrave Macmillan. It's an academic area of publications. He's got many articles, essays, scholarly journals under his belt. He's also a frequent contributor to television and podcast. This is the book, Unnatural Death. As always, we have all the information in our show notes. Richard, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's great talking to you.
Well, let's start with the provocation to write this. I always like to ask our guest, something happened along your study, research, experience, and you said, I need to contribute to this topic, this area.
Yeah, I was in my doctoral dissertation work, I was looking at 19th century European intellectual history. I actually got interested in that through Francis Schaeffer's works. I read a lot of Francis Schaeffer's works back as when I was an undergraduate in the 1970s. And I was fascinated by the way that he described the moral decline that had taken place as secular philosophies had taken root in Europe, especially since the Enlightenment period. And so I focused my attention on European intellectual history, and it just ended up, as I was at the University of Iowa, that I ended up studying under a historian of science. And so I decided to focus on a scientific issue, which was Darwinism. And so I did my doctoral dissertation on socialist Darwinism, looking at the way that Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and other socialist thinkers interpreted Darwinism. And then I did it as a follow, and as I was doing that project, I noticed that a lot of evolutionary thinkers in Germany in the late 19th century were trying to replace Judeo-Christian ethics and Kantian ethics and other kinds of ethics with evolutionary ethics. And so I decided to do a second project on that. And that's the book that actually turned into From Darwin to Hitler. Even though I wasn't thinking of Hitler at the time, I was just thinking of evolutionary ethics and looking at the way that it was being interpreted. And one of the things that I discovered as I began exploring evolutionary ethics in the late 19th century is that there were a lot of people who were pushing eugenics, which was the idea we need to improve human heredity, and an even more radical idea of euthanasia. And that there was early Darwinists in Germany. Ernst Haeckel, being the leading Darwinist in Germany, was promoting euthanasia in the late 19th century already. And the euthanasia movement was really built upon Darwinian thinking in that time. So that sort of got me interested in the issue of euthanasia. And in my book, From Darwin to Hitler, I had a chapter then on euthanasia that dealt with killing people with disabilities, which was what, at that time, that's what actually was the sort of the forefront of euthanasia, was not just killing people who voluntarily wanted to die, but it was killing people who had disabilities. And so that got me interested in the issue. And then from there, I got interested in the issues of how secular philosophies dealt with issues of the value of human life. And that ended up in my book in 2016 that came out, The Death of Humanity and the Case for Life, where I looked at the way that secular philosophies since the Enlightenment period had eroded the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic. And of course, one of those issues was euthanasia, also abortion, infanticide, and other kinds of things as well.
And interesting, you mentioned Schaefer. I was fortunate to hear him in the 70s. He and Coop were going around introducing the Whatever Happened to the Human Race series.
Right.
And he spoke at SMU. And I'll never forget, I mean, so many one-liners he said in that, what was once unthinkable, when it becomes thinkable, it will soon become a reality.
Yeah.
And you think of, how people will say things, ideas have consequences is a simpler way of saying it. But you have to go back and kind of, I appreciate what you've done in your book. And I think folks, if you have an interest in history and the history of these ideas, but you're also very practical in the sense of what are ramifications of infanticide, euthanasia, assisted suicide, these type of things. These are topics that are uncomfortable for Westerners to talk about.
Yeah, and in the last couple of chapters, I try to deal with some of the philosophical issues as well. I originally, when I was thinking about writing the book, I actually thought about expanding that even further, but I decided to sort of keep the historical part front and center. But yeah, it's been a difficult topic, and I go back to the Greco-Roman times in my book and briefly cover the Greco-Roman thinkers, and they're dealing with suicide. They had difficulty trying to deal with this issue of suicide. They didn't deal with so much with assisted suicide, although actually you do have the Hippocratic Oath, which does forbid doctors being involved in helping kill people or helping people die. Although in the Greek times, the Hippocratic Oath was not widespread. It was challenged. It was so there was disagreements among the Greeks and Roman philosophers about that very issue. So, even going back to Greco-Roman times, we see people have a lot of difficulty dealing with this issue of, should a person be allowed to commit suicide? Is that moral? Is it immoral? There was disagreements among the Greek philosophers over that very issue too.
I was struck when you introduced the Hippocratic Oath because there are a lot of debates about the meaning of that, correct? And were there iterations as well? I remember reading, I don't know if it was in your text or others.
Yeah, there have been some disagreements about the meanings of it, but most scholars, and I certainly agree, do believe that the Hippocrates was forbidding medical involvement in not only assisted suicide, but also abortion. So there are some that challenge that idea, but I think the text is clear enough that we can get that out of it.
In the first part of your book, you talk about some of the accepted definitions, and you reference our dear friend Johnny Erickson Tada, who's been on the program many times, but you give these 5 bullets, and let me just read them for our audience quickly. Assisted suicide, where a physician or other person provides the means for a patient to kill himself. Secondly, voluntary euthanasia, the patient asks to be killed and someone else kills them. Third, non-voluntary euthanasia. The patient is incompetent, unconscious, or otherwise unable to consent, and someone else kills them. Involuntary euthanasia. The patient is capable of giving or refusing consent, but is not asked, or the patient is killed against his will. And then passive euthanasia. A physician or other person withholds or withdraws life-saving measures from someone with the intent of causing death. A refusal to act causes death. And then parenthetically, the problem broadens in this definition. Not all situations where life-prolonging measures are withheld or withdrawn constitute euthanasia. In a medical setting, most do not. So, and then you say, when I use the term euthanasia, I'm referring to active forms of euthanasia. So again, I think most people, that's the first time they've heard those ways of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those definitions can bleed over into one another to some degree in certain cases, the way that, especially the way it gets applied today, in that there are people, there was a spectacular case a couple of years ago where a lady in, I think it was Belgium if I recall correctly, it was either the Netherlands or Belgium, which both have very liberal euthanasia laws, and she had signed an advance directive that if she became demented, that she wanted euthanasia. And so the time came when she when her relatives thought and her physician thought that she had reached a point where they should bring that advance directive into force, and they asked her if she wanted to partake of euthanasia at that point. And 3 times she rejected it. She said, "No, I do not want to die at this point." They went ahead and killed her anyway. So the notion that so in one sense they claim it was voluntary because she'd signed this advance directive. On the other hand, at the moment she was saying she didn't want to die. So there are some bleed over between those various positions. And the other thing I want to make clear too about the last one, that what's so-called passive euthanasia, is I don't like even to use the term euthanasia with that, because it's a totally different intent behind it. And this is one thing where some philosophers, James Rachels in particular, he's a bioethicist, he was at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, but he gave a very spectacular thing where he was claiming that passive euthanasia, what he calls passive euthanasia, that is allowing someone to die by withdrawing treatment from them, is equivalent to active euthanasia. And he used that to justify active euthanasia, that therefore we should be able to kill people. And so, but the problem with that is that the intent is completely different. And every bioethicist, even the staunchest Catholic or conservative Protestant bioethicist who looks at what some of these bioethicists are calling passive euthanasia, allows that. They believe that that is perfectly legitimate. It's perfectly legitimate to withdraw treatment because you are not intending their death. You're not trying to kill them. You're just recognizing their body can't function any longer. Their body can't keep them alive any longer. And so you would be delighted, in fact, if you withdrew the treatment and they kept on living. But the point of euthanasia is you're trying to kill them. You want them to die, and you're actively causing that to take place.
Well, when I read this preface, the introductions, and of course, intuitively, you went there before I even got into my mind. But when we talk about palliative care, and we talk about someone in hospice, there is, and I think many people would have a hard time differentiating. We're basically controlling their pain to a point of killing them. And you have a footnote in the back of your book called The Doctrine of Double Effect.
Right.
And I appreciated that. It would helpful for our listeners and viewers to understand what you're talking about here.
Yeah, palliative care is something that people who are opposed to euthanasia, like myself, are very strongly supportive of, and hospice care and as well. Hospice was actually originated by people who were doing it out of compassion for people because they didn't want to go this route of euthanasia and killing them. They wanted to give them a comfortable death. And by the way, interestingly, the word euthanasia before the mid-19th century actually meant providing someone with a comfort and trying to give them a good death. And it didn't mean hastening their death until the late 19th century when the so-called euthanasia movement began co-opting that word and changed the meaning of it to mean that. So when you have people working with palliative care and such, in fact, and by the way, I should also say this too, where euthanasia has become more accepted, palliative care sort of gets pushed into the background because it's not as necessary anymore. So they don't actually, it's been shown that there's actually less emphasis on palliative care because we can just kill you. You don't need to manage your pain. But the doctrine of double effect that you mentioned there is the idea, and again, the staunchest Catholic and conservative Protestant bioethicists on this particular issue all agree that there's nothing wrong with managing pain, even if it does happen to hasten their death, as long as the intent is not to hasten their death. You're not trying to get them to die faster. You're just trying to ease their pain. It may well be that the medications you use may end up hastening their death, but that's not your purpose. That's not what you're trying to do. And so you're just trying to help them have a greater comfort, less pain, and such. And pain is an enemy. Pain and death are both enemies. So we should be struggling against pain. We should be trying to help people to ease their pain in the end of their life. We shouldn't be trying to, make people suffer as much as they can. And some people, when they frame issues about euthanasia, they call it compassion, death, compassionate death. and such and things, because they very often do try to frame pain as being the key driving force here. But what's interesting about this issue is that pain often is not the issue why people are getting assisted suicide and euthanasia. In Oregon, which has had assisted suicide longer than any state in the United States, does surveys of the people who partake of assisted suicide, and they ask them the question, why, what are the factors that are causing you to want to have assisted suicide? And they let them list multiple factors too, so they can list 6 or 8 factors if they want to. Interestingly, pain is listed in less than 1/3 of the people. Pain and fear of pain, both of those. So not even just pain, but fear of pain. Pain and fear of pain is listed as in less than 1/3 of the people who request assisted suicide. Much more dominant is the idea that I can't do the things that I used to be able to do. I'm unable to, do the things that I find enjoyable in life or whatever like that. Also, there's the issue of I feel like a burden to my family and friends and society and such. Those are much bigger issues. And those could be dealt with in other ways than killing the person. If the person feels like a burden, let's make them not feel like a burden. Go ahead.
And you observe in a lot of these other European countries too that loneliness was a big factor, correct?
Oh yeah, exactly. And the studies have shown that people who partake in assisted suicide and euthanasia tend to have less social connections, less close family connections than others. So loneliness does play a very key role. And interestingly, earlier this year, the Surgeon General of the United States declared loneliness an epidemic in the United States. Yeah. And it's driving a lot of other health problems, as well as people wanting to escape from their life through either assisted suicide or euthanasia. So yeah, loneliness does play a very key role. And this is where I think we as Christians especially can sort of step in and try to alleviate people's suffering of loneliness, right? By engaging with them, by spending time with people, by visiting people, by doing things to help them to find satisfaction in their life through social connections.
Well, it's ancillary as well, but being in ministry for 40 some years, quite a few widows and widowers that I've known, and some widowers even in my current situation that I pursue and have lunch or coffee with, and loneliness is enormous for them. The routines, and I don't think they're suicidal. I don't think they want to die, but it certainly hastens the idea of why am I still here? And you do hear the burden issue a lot. And you address this also about the cost of medical health costs as we get older. I think the statistics will spend more from 60 to 70, and if we live 70 to 80 on health care than the cumulative of our entire life.
Yeah. And, interestingly, in this issue of marriage that you mentioned and your spouse passing, there actually have been quite a number of cases in the Netherlands where people have died simultaneously when they were married. And so requested euthanasia simultaneously because they don't want to live without their spouse. And so that's the loneliness issue, or fear of loneliness in this case, is a driving factor in many people's decisions.
And I think that's probably not discussed a lot. My mother, after my dad died 14 years ago, she was inconsolable for 8 years. And she would say, I miss your father. I miss your father. And after 67 years of marriage, whatever it was, there's just this hollow in the dailiness. And you understand it. But back to some of the things in your book that I found striking. 10 states in the United States have legalized some form of suicide, and also the District of Columbia. Is that still correct?
Yeah, it's 9 states plus District of Columbia, 10 jurisdictions in total.
Okay. And in those jurisdictions, if a person says, okay, there's got to be a process, correct? This isn't just I go to my primary care physician and say, give me the medications. There's a process whereby he or she is approved.
That's right. In the United States, we do not have euthanasia in the United States, which is the physician is not allowed to inject you with a poison substance as they can in the Netherlands or Belgium or Canada. Canada also has euthanasia. But in the United States, we have assisted suicide, which in these 10 jurisdictions, which means that the physician can prescribe poison pills to a patient who then takes them themselves. At least they're supposed to take them themselves, although, by the way, there's no real oversight over this. Someone could give the person those pills without their knowledge once they get them. But they have to request them first. They have to be approved by physicians. They have to be approved by 2 physicians in most states. And they have to the physicians have to verify that the person is in, at least as best as they can tell by medical knowledge, in the last 6 months of a terminal illness. Those are the ways that the laws are framed in most of the states in the United States where we have assisted suicide. Now, interestingly, in countries like Belgium and Netherlands, which have euthanasia and have had euthanasia and assisted suicide much longer, in the 1980s and 90s, they were already being brought in by courts. Oregon is in the United States in the mid-1990s was the first to get assisted suicide here. They have opened it up to even more people. It's not just people with terminal illnesses. The Netherlands and Belgium allow people who have just what they consider long-term suffering of various sorts.
Right.
And in those countries, they even will define suffering as being mental suffering. So people that have mental troubles, difficulties, psychological problems. Let me give you one example of this. It's rather tragic. A lady, I think she was 44 years old, if I recall correctly. Let me get it up here. Yeah, 44-year-old Belgian woman in 2012 had an eating disorder. And because of that eating disorder, she went to a psychiatrist to seek psychiatric help. Unfortunately for her, the psychiatrist she went to, instead of helping her, sexually abused her. And because of the sexual abuse together with the eating disorder that was already there, she sought out help from another psychiatrist, but the help she sought out there was to die, euthanasia. And so another psychiatrist signed off on euthanasia for this woman who then was killed because of her mental suffering that she was going through as a result of these things. So in countries like Netherlands and Belgium, they've expanded the definition of suffering to include lots of different things, including mental agony, and are killing people for quite a variety of reasons now.
Well, and you recount, I was trying to find it in my underlining, you recount, I think it was Canada, a woman went to, because she was depressed and discouraged, and she went for counseling, and because of the medical backlog there, she was unable to see someone, and the intake counselor recommended that she consider assisted suicide.
Yeah, and that's not an isolated example. Canada's had several instances of this kind of thing where social workers or medical personnel have, and sometimes not subtly at all. I mean, just up front, just said, you can get medical assistance in dying if you really want to. Now, let me give you one example of this that I find very striking and sad. In 2019, a woman named Christine Gauthier, who was a retired corporal in the Canadian military, she was trying to get the Veterans Affairs Canada to give her a wheelchair ramp because she was confined to a wheelchair. She was actually a Paralympian too at one point, but she's trying to get a wheelchair ramp because she was having to crawl out of her house and then get into her wheelchair, and the case manager from the Veterans Affairs told her, "Madam, if you are really so desperate, we can give you medical assistance in dying now." And she was outraged by that and said this about it. She said, "I can't believe that you will give me an injection to help me die, but you will not give me the tools I need to help me live." And so there have been a number of examples in Canada of this kind of thing where people have been offered assisted suicide because they're either running up huge hospital bills. There's also been cases in Canada where people who are homeless have sought medical assistance in dying. Now, you can't legally get medical assistance in dying just because you're homeless, but usually they'll try to find some other kind of physical, if they have some other kind of physical ailment or something like that that would qualify them, they'll use that as their excuse, even though homelessness might be the real reason for it. There was one case, for example, where a guy had a long-term illness, and he was willing to live with that, but he was being threatened with being kicked out of his home because the rent was getting raised and he couldn't afford it, and so he decided to seek euthanasia. I think he didn't actually go through with it, if I recall correctly. I think he was he didn't go through with that, but that is a motivating factor in some people's lives, and they'll find ways to try to get it.
I have a very close friend here in the Nashville area who is an OBGYN, and early in his practice he performed a few abortions, not many. He was an OBGYN first and foremost, but in those days. But he had a profound conversion experience, came to Christ, and no longer performed abortions. He had a classmate who became an abortion provider, and if memory serves, it's like 12,000 abortions this guy had proudly carried out under the auspices of My Body, My Choice and healthcare initiatives. And he and I have talked many, many times about how you go through the same training, the same, to go through med school, to do your residency programs, your rotations, to see life, all these wonderful things, and then to spend your career ending life. And we often talked about, even in a sane world, how can one side of the hospital, let's say, take life and one do all it can to preserve life? And from a historical perspective, I'd love to hear your assessment of how we got there.
Well, interestingly, there's still a lot of pushback, and that's why more countries haven't accepted assisted suicide and euthanasia. In fact, we just had this last week. The governor of Delaware vetoed a assisted suicide bill that barely passed the Delaware legislature. And he's a Democrat, so it's not even just a partisan issue, too. Republicans tend to be more opposed to assisted suicide than do the Democratic side, but there's a lot of Democrats who are opposed to it, too. And in the medical profession, there's a lot of physician opposition to assisted suicide. The American Medical Association still opposes a physician-assisted suicide, although some of their branches, like the California Medical Association, has gone neutral on the stance, and so it depends on the state you're in to some degree too. Also, countries like the Netherlands and Belgium that have had euthanasia and assisted suicide for much longer time, the medical profession tends to be much more accepting of it than in other countries. But a lot of other countries, their medical profession is still opposed to physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So in some places, there's a minority of physicians who are involved, but sometimes they're very zealously involved. And so sometimes you have lots of certain physicians who are doing lots of euthanasia and assisted suicide, for example. And there's some that are pushing it so fanatically they're actually setting up in Belgium, if I recall correctly, they have had like a mobile clinic that goes to try to help people, who can't access it through other means and things like that. Switzerland, of course, has suicide clinics that people come from all over the world to go to commit suicide. And so Switzerland has a pretty advanced case of assisted suicide there as well. And again, there it can be for just about any, in Switzerland it can be for any reason at all. A lady from Italy who was getting elderly decided that she didn't like the fact that she had lost her beauty that she had great pride in. And so she went to Switzerland and got assisted suicide without her family even knowing about it. They didn't find out about it till after she was dead.
In your research, do you see the socialistic, where medical expenses are part of, your cost of living, if you will, as opposed to, a private insurance or like we would have in the West? Is there a higher incidence of it in countries that, you see where I'm going, that this is part of the provided health care?
Well, I'm not sure that that's really what's driving it, although that does play a role to some degree. I mean, economics does always have its foot in the door there somewhere. But even with private insurers, too, I mean, the private insurance companies sometimes are are supportive of euthanasia and assisted suicide because it saves them money on having to provide the health care for the people. So both in countries where you have socialistic medicine and in the private insurance realm, there are people who have financial interests in people dying earlier and such. And this is, I think, too, why we get that issue of people feeling like a burden, too, because medical care is being provided to them and such. And so they feel like, okay, maybe I should end my life so that I'm not being a financial burden to my family or friends or the state or whoever it is that's providing for their hospitalization.
You tell a couple of stories like
care.
that, a couple of accounts, and one of them in particular was a young man who his medical bills were so astronomical that he just said, go ahead and help me die.
Yeah, I think the case I remember actually was a guy in Canada who had astronomical medical bills, and the medical personnel in the hospital were encouraging him to get medical assistance from dying, even though he didn't want it. Really, I don't remember if he actually went for it or not. I think he didn't. I think he refused it, actually, the case that I'm thinking of. But he was shocked that people would be offering him assisted suicide in these cases.
You spend, and you open the book with this announcement, if you will, which I always appreciate when authors tell us where they're going. The last two chapters are the sort of the practical application of what you call the slippery, or refer to, the slippery slope argument, and it kind of harkens back to Schaeffer. What was once unthinkable, when it's thinkable, will soon become a reality. And you spend a great deal of effort trying to explain, whether it was the Nazis trying to eradicate people with disabilities, or what's the next step, and who makes that decision when it's time for, okay, are you going to live or die?
Yeah, the issue of the slippery slope, and most philosophers, by the way, consider the slippery slope argument one of the strongest arguments against euthanasia and assisted suicide. And the way I see it, the big issue here is that once you decide that some people's lives don't have value, so you're basically buying into a human inequality. Some people's lives have value, some don't. And that's basically what we're saying when we pass these laws that allow assisted suicide, because what we're saying is that these people who are in this particular stage of life, if they're within in the United States, it's the last 6 months of a terminal illness, their lives are not valuable enough for us to protect. And not only that, but we will help you, to die. On the other hand, if you're not in that category, then we will have all these suicide prevention programs. We'll spend millions of dollars on suicide prevention programs to keep you from dying and to protect you from yourself. And so the big problem, that is the way I see it in terms of the slippery slope, is that once you open the door, once you decide that some category of persons is not worth protecting, is not valuable enough for us to protect, then it becomes arbitrary where you draw that line. Why do we do it at 6 months? Well, basically, we do it at 6 months because we've tried to be sort of conservative. The people who pass these laws are trying to keep it fairly narrowly constrained at first, and then later they're going to try to broaden it into more and more. And this is actually, has happened again and again in Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, and also even in Oregon. Oregon, for example, originally said only residents of Oregon could get assisted suicide. Now anyone can go to Oregon and get assisted suicide. So they begin opening up to broader and broader categories. They begin calling what they called safeguards when they first legislated these things. Euthanasia proponents now refer to as restrictions that they're trying to get rid of. So it begins broadening out, and there's no logical place to stop. Where do you stop it? Okay, Netherlands says any kind of suffering, not just terminal illness, including and not just physical suffering, mental suffering. So it can expand more and more depending on the particular society, because it's basically arbitrary where you draw that line once you've decided that all humans are not equal.
You talk about a debate you had with Peter Singer, and the question was, is human life intrinsically valuable? And you refer to Joseph Fletcher had proposed various traits to define personhood that differed in some ways from those advanced by Singer. And you go on to explain sort of the differentiation. He claims that newborn infants, even if perfectly healthy, should not be considered persons and thus have no right to life, but he refuses to designate a particular age when a human becomes a person.
Yeah, and in fact, I don't remember if I say this in the book, but really, by the logic of his position, some infants would be persons earlier than others. It depends on their mental capacities, because he's arguing that mental capacities, your ability to use rationality, your ability to plan the future, that these are what gives you value, not just being a human. And so that would mean that different people would have those traits at different ages, and it'd be. Right. And again, when would you draw the line? And Singer is very cagey about not drawing lines at particular times. Certain times he has actually said things. At one point early in his career, he made the point that he thought that a baby in the first month of its life should be allowed to be killed. So infanticide would be legitimate within the first month of an infant's life. Later on, he pulled away from that and refused to draw any kind of line because there really is no way to draw the line, and that's the problem. And the same thing is true on the elderly end. Once you're dealing with people with dementia, when do they reach that point? And Singer would say that if a person has dementia, there's going to be a point at which they are not persons any longer, and so they are no longer no longer have the right to life. But where do you draw the line? And Singer doesn't, and he can't, because there is no place to draw the line, because all of these traits are on a continuum. Rationality, ability to plan the future, these are all on a continuum. Some people have more of it, some people have less of it. Does that mean people that are smarter have greater value of life? Well, maybe Singer thinks that because he's got an endowed chair at Princeton. So he may think that smarter people have more value in life, but that's not the case. We all are created in the image of God, and we all have value in God's eyes, and we need to uphold that human equality.
He doesn't have to worry about his paycheck. You also talk about assisted suicide or execution. A recent Belgium case vividly illustrated elasticity of supposed safeguards for assisted suicide. 2007, Genevieve, and I'm probably going to mispronounce her name, Lehermite, murdered her five children, then attempted suicide. She survived, was convicted of murder, sentenced to life in prison. In 2019, transferred to a psychiatric facility. And 23 Belgian physicians euthanized her at her request because she was suffering in her circumstances.
Yeah, that's not the only.
You can't make it up.
Yeah, and this is interesting because in the European context, Europeans overwhelmingly reject capital punishment. But now we're coming into a phase of history where they are killing people in prison. This is not the only example either. There are other people imprisoned also who are arguing that they are suffering because of their imprisonment, and therefore they should be entitled to euthanasia. And some are being euthanized as a result of it. So we're getting capital punishment.
You quote a reference that says you quote a reference that says the death penalty is creeping through the rear door.
Yeah, so it's coming in there.
Yeah. So now the pressure to end one's life. We've talked about this somewhat about financial burdens, burdens to other people. This one gentleman was charged $1,800 per day for his hospital care. He has $2 million worth of bills already. Nurses told me that I should end my life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very tragic. And, interestingly, one of the big arguments, in the last chapter of my book, I actually talk about the argument from autonomy. And one of the things that this particular the thing illustrates that you just read was that social pressure is immense. People can talk all they want about autonomy, but there's all sorts of social pressure that gets put upon people, and sometimes not as overtly as what the one you just described. Sometimes it's a lot more subtle than that. Like, I just feel I'm a burden, even though no one's telling me I'm a burden. I just feel like I'm a burden. So autonomy isn't. There is no. Autonomy is a great ideal. Yes, we all want freedom. We all want to be able to make decisions about our life and things like that. But the reality is that autonomy doesn't work that way in reality. Well, there's several reasons why it doesn't work that way. For one thing, if we believe in a supreme being, as I do, then He's the boss. I'm not the boss. Autonomy means I'm a law to myself. That's literally what the word autonomy means. Nomos is law, auto is self. So it's self-law. I'm a law to myself. Well, there's a supreme being who has something to say about that. And even if you don't believe in a supreme being, interestingly, an argument that I make in my book against the autonomy argument is that if you don't believe in a supreme being or afterlife, once you kill yourself through euthanasia or assisted suicide, you have no more autonomy. You're gone. You're dead. And so you're actually ending your autonomy. It's like selling yourself into slavery. It's not legal in the United States to sell yourself into slavery. Why? Because we don't believe that a person should be enslaved. That means you do not have the right to sell yourself into slavery. Well, you should also not have the right to end your own autonomy. And that's exactly what you're doing if you're committing assisted suicide.
Two final points, and I was so glad to read this because I could not have articulated this in my own thinking, but I was like, okay, that's where I was curious. When you talk about how others influence us, and this is why, quote, the suicide contagion, close quote, exists. Suicide contagion, also called the weather effect, is a well-known phenomenon that the World Health Organization and other organizations have published media guidelines about how to report suicides. The increase of suicides in the wake of highly publicized suicides suggests that suicide is a decision strongly influenced by the deeds of others. And there's so many things when we think of social media and the TikTok thing and what it means to be an influencer. It's, we're affected by these stories we read. Oh, I never thought about that, but some famous person takes their own life. Well, then, I feel like they feel, and I should take my life.
Yeah, and journalists have these guidelines that they're supposed to report in such a way as not to try to stir up more people committing suicide, except when we're talking about assisted suicide. Then they can take people like Brittany Maynard, which was splashed all over the journals and everything back in the mid-20-teens when she wanted assisted suicide, and she was made a great hero by the journalistic establishment until she ended up going to Oregon, establishing her residence. At that time, you still needed to be a resident of Oregon, so she established residency. She lived there long enough to establish residency and then took assisted suicide. So she was made to be a great hero. And this has an effect on people. Other people see that and follow suit. And so there's this kind of pressure as well, which I think breaks down the so-called autonomy argument.
Well, the final point I wanted to get your response to, you write about Dr. Kenneth Stevens, a physician in Oregon, had a patient named Jeanette Hall. She suffered from cancer, and he was recommending chemo. She didn't want to do that. She requested assisted suicide, which was legal. And instead of jotting out a prescription, you write, for the poisonous drugs, Stevens compassionately asked Hall about her family. Based on their conversation, Hall realized she did have a reason to live. She reconsidered her desire for assisted suicide, accepted the treatment, which, as expected, caused her to lose her hair, etc. 5 years later, she thanked Dr. Stevens, telling him, quote, "You saved my life. If I had gone to a doctor that believed in assisted suicide, I would not be here. I'd be dead."
Yes, her autonomy would have been ended if she had been able to take assisted suicide. But on the other hand, he saved her life. And this, by the way, also underscores something about the Oregon law, which a lot of people may not realize. And that is that in Oregon, you can be considered a terminally ill person if you reject medication. So if you're required to take insulin, or if you have to have other kinds of procedures, to keep you alive, if you decide you just don't want to do those things, you can be declared terminal and you can get assisted suicide. And whereas if you kept up with your regimen of, the insulin or whatever, you might live for decades. And like in this lady's case, she gets her chemotherapy. She's still living 5 years later, and who knows how many years she's still going to live down the line. But she would have been declared within 6 months of death, or she could have been, by a medical professional, if he had believed in assisted suicide and decided, okay, she didn't want to chemo. Okay, we can say she's in her last 6 months of life.
Well, the good news is that doctor said, there's others to consider. I know
Yes.
in ministry, again, over the years when we've had a suicide in a church, the repercussions on family and friends, you talk about a scar, a mark that's left forever, as opposed to, people love you. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, it's hard to care for someone who's got a complicated health story, but they love you. And there's a reason for you to be here. And, our friend John Erickson Tata is living proof of that, 58 years and counting, that the remarkable way God has used her when there were certainly times she would like to have died. So.
And although people will look at the person who is being given euthanasia and assisted suicide and say, well, we're ending their suffering, you're right. There's suffering in the family still, even with those people. Many people are not.
Yeah.
It's not always that everyone's agreed that that's a good thing, and very often that does cause grief to spouses, to children, and others who are survivors.
Dr. Richard Weikart, the information, as always, in the show notes, Unnatural Death, a book you might want to check out, along with his other writings. Richard, thanks for coming on the podcast, and thanks for your scholarship, your tenacity to put these together for us, and blessings on your endeavors in the future, friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.